Hey guys, it's Alex, and today I'm here with a book review for The Serpent King by Jeff Zentner. This was recommended to me by Linda's World of Books, and I will leave a link to her channel and the video where she talked about this book down below. This is a YA contemporary novel about three teenagers who are living in a rural town in Tennessee. Lydia runs a popular fashion blog and dreams of getting out of the small town. Dill's father was a preacher who went to prison after a scandal, and Dill is still living with the backlash. And Travis lives most of his life online, obsessed with a popular fantasy series. Now in their senior year, the three of them prepare for the eventuality of parting ways. I gave this book 4 stars. I had very mixed feelings about it because there were some aspects that I thoroughly enjoyed, but I had a lot of issues with the storytelling. But at the end of the day, the emotions kind of went out for me, and I really did enjoy this book. It only took me about a day or two to read, and I felt like I was reading it slower than normal. I spent a great many hours reading this book, and it just felt like it lasted for a lot longer than YA contemporaries usually do. And that's not a negative thing, like I thoroughly enjoyed that. It was just a book that was a lot denser than I think I was expecting when I first got into it. This book definitely hit hard on the emotions. Like, I love reading heavier contemporaries that are very emotional and very difficult, and this book made me cry. This book made me cry so hard. I kind of felt that the reason I was crying was kind of cheap and was manipulating me as the reader, but it was a very successful manipulation, so it is kind of hard to look too badly on that. It was so emotional. I was reading this in front of my boyfriend because he was playing a video game and I was reading, and I literally had to leave the room at one point just because I was crying too hard, and I was like, okay, I need to put this book down and like go calm down for a second. And then when I came back and started reading again, I just immediately started crying once more. But definitely a very emotional book. And if it can make me cry that hard, it's obviously doing something right. Like, for all my issues, the emotions were 100% there. And I think at the end of the day, that matters more than anything else to me. I also loved how much this book dealt with classism. Of the characters, one of them, Lydia, who runs the fashion blog and really plans to go to college and get out and leave the small town forever, she comes from a very wealthy family, at least wealthy in terms of small rural town in Tennessee. Her father is a dentist, her mother is a real estate agent, and she lives in a big house. She's constantly talking about Trader Joe's trips or going to Panera. Whereas the other two characters are somewhere around or below the poverty line. Travis and Dill both already work jobs, not because they want extra spending money, but because their families need the money. They're working so that they can eat. Dill especially is often contrasted with Lydia, whereas her parents will go on grocery runs to Trader Joe's once a month and come back with a car full of groceries. And Dill will eat a dinner consisting of expired food from the grocery store where he works because he can get it for free or for cheap. And I really enjoyed that contrast. I think a lot of times when classism or poverty are dealt with in books, it's often just focusing on the poverty. They don't really have much to contrast it with in terms of another main character who also has a point of view. And for all that Lydia knew her friends didn't have the money that she had, she didn't understand the nuances of it, and I really appreciated how that was done with her character. I thought it was very interesting to have these characters for whom this is part of their daily life, and then to have another character who's like, yes, I understand my friends are very poor, but she doesn't fully understand. And I really enjoyed that. I did think at times it was quite heavy-handed and a little bit not over the top in terms of what was actually happening, but over the top in terms of kind of how it was written, how it was contrasted. It was a little bit obvious and a little bit too much for me, but overall I did thoroughly enjoy that element of the story. One of the specific writing styles that I had an issue with was that Jeff Zentner writes a lot of present tense flashbacks, which was very strange to read. This is a past tense book, most of it is written in the past tense, but there would be random flashbacks throughout where a character would see something or smell something and they would be like, oh, this takes me back, and they would be like, oh, that smell was familiar, and suddenly I'm 13 and in my father's church, and it was very weird and awkward and abrupt to read. It was kind of jarring. I was not the biggest fan of that. It always kind of took me out of the story. I do enjoy flashbacks sometimes depending on how well they're done. I just think in this, I did not enjoy the way he specifically wrote them. I had 2 major issues overall that really did have me considering whether I should knock this down to 3 stars or not. So I wanted to kind of focus on those for a moment before I get into like the minor issues at the end. The first was Lydia as a character. I already mentioned that she comes from a very affluent family, at least relative to her town and her friends. And that was a part of the story, the fact that she just doesn't understand. And growth is a very big part of stories. Like, I adore character growth. I like when characters are very flawed and then learn as the story goes along. But there comes a point when I don't care if they become a better person. I don't care if they start treating their friends better or learn the error of their ways. I just don't care because they're already such a crappy person that I just want it to stop. Like, I want their friends to leave them because they don't deserve those friends anymore. And that was kind of how I felt with Lydia. She was just a thoroughly unpleasant person who treated her friends like garbage. At first it made sense within the story, and I could tell what he was doing. He was trying to contrast the poverty and her ignorance of their poverty, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed that element and what he was trying to do, but it eventually just got worse and worse to the point where I was like, I don't want this character to have a redemption arc. I don't want this character to learn the error of their ways. I want this character to get her comeuppance, and I want her friends to ditch her because she's awful. And that's not really how you're meant to be feeling about this character. She's supposed to have flaws but still be like, oh, well, she's learning, she's a kid. And I didn't feel that. She was just an awful person. At one point, Dill has a very bad day, and he meets up with his friends, and he starts to take it out on Lydia. He starts asking her, why don't you ever mention me or Travis on your blog? You have this very famous blog, and when I say famous, I mean she's got like 100,000 Twitter followers. Like, she has a well-known blog. She's been interviewed by famous magazines. Like, she interviews famous people on her blog. Such and such, it's famous. But she never mentions her friends on her blog. She never posts pictures of them, for all that she posts pictures of her outfits and the random people she meets in stores. So Dill's like, hey, why don't you ever mention us? Are you ashamed of us? And Lydia gets mad at him and starts going off about how just because he has a bad day, he shouldn't take it out on her, and that's not fair. And it just goes on until she walks away, and eventually Dill has to grovel and beg for her forgiveness and just promise that he'll never do it again. She actively makes him promise not to ask again because she says she has a good reason for protecting his privacy by never mentioning him on her blog. But earlier in the book, she literally said that she never mentioned Dill or Travis because neither of them were on brand for her blog. Literally, the words she used were on brand. I checked because I thought that was my words and her words were less harsh, but no, she literally says they're off brand for her blog. But she has no problem using them in her college admissions essay because, as she says, they're perfectly on brand for that. That was the language she used. I don't care about this character anymore. I want her to get some kind of justice in the story, and I want her to not have a redemption arc because I didn't feel like as a character she deserved it, nor did she earn the redemption arc, in my opinion. I just really disliked her, and I hated the way that her character was treated in the story. Like, these were minor issues when she's literally just treating her friends like garbage. She also talked about how she wanted her friends to go to college. She pushed Dill very heavily to go to college, even though, as previously stated, she's very affluent. She has a lot of resources. Applying to college is expensive. Going to college is very expensive. Her parents can help her financially. Dill has no help, and Dill's like, okay, my mother doesn't support me. If I go to college, this is the end of my relationship with my parents. And she still pushes him very heavily to go, and even tells her father that she wants her friends to go to college because she doesn't want them to lead pathetic lives. Like, literally the language she used once again. And it just rubbed me the wrong way the entire book. It was too much for me. I like character growth, but there comes a point when a character just crosses that line of, I don't want them to be redeemed because they're just too crappy of a person for me to support them ever. And that was how I felt about Lydia, and it kind of ruined the book a little bit for me. My second big issue was with one of the characters in the book. This is told in first person, and it alternates narration between Lydia, Travis, and Dill. When you have an equal amount of narration, you kind of need, by necessity, for all of the characters to be able to carry the story on their own, because essentially they each have a third of their book to themselves. Two of the characters had their own plot lines and arcs, but one character didn't have much of a story arc. They just kind of existed throughout the book until it was time for tragedy, so that their tragedy, their personal life story, could be used to propel the other character stories. And I didn't like that. I just felt like this poor kid who had so much tragedy in their life was being used to manipulate the reader's emotions, which, again, I was very well manipulated because it made me cry. But I still felt manipulated. It still felt like they were a cheap prop who was being used. It didn't feel authentic within the story. It felt like this was a character who was inserted specifically to make people sad, specifically to push the other two characters to grow as people, particularly Lydia. I didn't like that this kid who had a very rough life, a rough family, who had a very tragic story, was used to make Lydia grow to be a better person. I didn't think she deserved it, first of all, and I thought the other character deserved so much better, and it very much rubbed me the wrong way and made me super uncomfortable to read. And I think that was the big reason I was like, this book might deserve lower than 4 stars. But again, it made me very emotional, so I kind of decided that I was going to give it the full 4 stars. The last couple of small points are also about Lydia, who was kind of the catalyst for me in this book when it came to all my issues. It wasn't that they were all specifically about her, it was just that they were most obvious within her character and her role in the book. But first, her feminism. I didn't like the way her feminism was written. It was very shallow. It was a lot of just like calling men gross and using buzzwords and not really having any depth to her feminism, which I would have been more okay with had it felt like it was intentional, like it was supposed to be her being kind of an immature kid, because like, yeah, you have a lot to learn when you're 17. I don't expect your feminism to be full of depth yet. I expect you to still have so much more to learn and you're like just getting into it. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like this was Zentner's kind of approach to feminism. This is what he thinks feminism is. And I'm not saying that is exactly what he thinks feminism is, because like, I have no idea. I don't know this dude. All I know about him is from reading this book. It's just that was how I felt while reading this book. That's how the way it was written made me feel. So it kind of did make me uncomfortable, and I didn't enjoy that aspect. And then the last was Lydia Sexuality. At a certain point in the story, she's doing a Q&A on her blog, and one of the frequently asked questions she gets is, are you a lesbian? And she's also called several slurs relating to being a lesbian, and she answers the question by saying it depends. She answers on a case-by-case basis depending on who's asking. She's like, mostly I would answer yes, I am a raging lesbian, but sometimes I would say no. The only relationship she has in this book is with a guy, and she never confirms her sexuality in any way. And it did make me kind of uncomfortable to read. And I think that would have made me less uncomfortable had this book been written by an LGBT plus woman, because then I would have felt like, okay, this is an Own Voices novel. This is someone in the community writing this for her own community. But it's not. It's written by a cis man who, as far as I can tell, is a straight man, although he's married to a woman, but I couldn't find anything that like specifically discusses his sexuality. But the fact that it was so wishy-washy and it never confirmed if she was LGBT plus or if that was just something she was saying for her blog, because it did kind of go in line with the way she was treating feminism, like as though being a lesbian or calling herself a lesbian kind of had something to do with her feminism rather than it just being sexuality, which I know is weird to say. Like, I'm not saying that's what being a lesbian is, just the way she treated feminism and like kind of the shallowness and superficiality in her feminism kind of made me feel like potentially her saying, yes, I'm a raging lesbian, had something to do with that rather than her sexuality. And the whole wishy-washy nature of this and being written by a man just made me very uncomfortable and rubbed me the wrong way. And I did not enjoy that in the slightest. But again, those were very small things. They weren't a major part of the story in any way. It kind of felt like very much written by a man in that regard. But like I said, at the end of the day, this book made me cry a lot, and it has to be doing something right if it makes me cry as hard as it did. I did enjoy it. I read it so quickly and I was invested the entire time. So for all my issues, this was a 4-star book, and I would still recommend it if you think you can get past the issues that I had, because I was able to get past them. They bothered me, but not enough for me to rate this book any lower than 4 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I can definitely see why this book gets so much praise and why it's so highly rated, but at the same time, I can also see why people wouldn't enjoy this book. So I'm very glad I read it. It made me happy to read in that way that it kind of crushed me emotionally, but it was thoroughly enjoyable. Let me know down below if you've read The Serpent King and what you thought of it if you have. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.